I'm going to continue the talk that Jeremy began by talking a little bit about the area of resource politics that I've been engaging in lately, and that's really the financialization of nature and natural resources. Thinking about resource politics to me is really about thinking about struggles over resources and value. And these struggles, of course, they cross scales and jurisdictional levels. And it's really interesting to think about them because of the complexity of these struggles. And it's also incredibly important to think about it because of all that's at stake. So first I'm going to talk just a little bit about financialization. So I use a lot of $20 words out of necessity in my research, but financialization, just as an introduction, it's a term that describes any sort of economic system or process that attempts to reduce value that's to be exchanged into a financial instrument, some sort of tradable unit. This might be tangible things or intangible things, promises, as long as they can be reduced into a unit that can be traded. Basically, that's what a financial instrument is, implicated in the process of financialization. Specifically, when we're talking about the financialization of nature or the financialization of natural resources, what we're talking about is sets of techniques, some of which are very sophisticated, some of which are still being developed and will be developed in the future, for bringing non-market natural phenomena in line with market logics and processes. Specifically, the logics and processes associated with global financial markets. In terms of the kind of local end or place-based end of financialization, we can talk about bringing issues of conservation and environmental governance, place-focused environmental governance, into the financial sphere and vice versa. So it's not just a one-way kind of flow or application. Financialization involves a lot of overlapping processes. So a lot of times terms like privatization, commercialization, commodification, and financialization get all lumped together. But really, these are different processes that often work together. They're nonlinear, and they can contribute to kind of broader processes of linking non-market things to financial markets. And so basically, when you're talking about financialization, specifically, I think a good way to think of it is a transformation in which commercialized value embodied in a natural product or service is abstracted as an easily traded financial instrument. But of course, if you look at the literature and you talk about the financialization of nature, the financialization of any other aspect of life or non-market good, you're going to see variable definitions of that process. But I just wanted to kind of give you a primer on that. So when we're talking about nature financialization, we can talk about all sorts of environmental functions that can become subject to this kind of financial abstraction or abstraction and commodification. In this process, what we're, just to basically model it, I guess, we can think of intact ecosystems, places. These might be national parks or, particular valued forests that are set aside. Intact ecosystems that are kind of envisioned as natural capital, as a sort of asset that belongs to a country or a part of a country that gives rise to particular services. So here I've just listed a variety of environmental functions that can be subject to financialization. So terrestrial biodiversity and its functions, marine biodiversity and its functions, water purification services, forest carbon sequestration, marine carbon sequestration, coastal carbon sequestration, erosion control services, coastal protection services. We can think of air purification, just about any kind of crucial environmental thing that allows us to survive as humans can actually be kind of grouped in this category of environmental functions that can be subject to financialization, as long as they can be assessed in a way that makes them packageable as financial instruments, credits, offsets, derivatives, things like that. So really, when we're talking about financialization of natural resources, this is kind of, in a very broad sense, a process that gives rise to natural resource commodities and specifically financialized environmental goods and services. But really, this process is all about kind of capturing the value that we or certain people see as represented in intact ecosystems. Specifically, those who prefer to think of intact ecosystems as representing some sort of natural capital asset that should give rise to some sort of tradable commodity. So resource financialization has actually been around for a while, well, a recent while. So the first kind of things that you could think of as, big time resource financialization projects happened with wetlands banking and endangered species banking in the 1980s in the United States. And various projects have, and programs have been enacted that involve these principles for quite some time. But nothing has really come together at the scale of what's called the green economy. Is this a familiar term to everybody? Probably so. I mean, lots of greening and talking of the green economy when we think about development today, because it's really become a very important paradigm in development, and specifically around sustainable development. And ideas in the green economy actually have a really key role in contemporary notions of sustainability that are organized around the idea of not just making sure that the environment is has integrity in the long term, but making sure that the environment can work to support itself economically, and also that in turn the global economy will work to support the environment. It's kind of a central notion to these kind of new ideas of sustainability from this kind of green economy lens. So as as it is now, it's a policy package, really. When you're talking about the green economy, it's a policy package, a really flexible policy package originating from really the UN Environment Program angle, but involving a lot of partnerships and collaborations. But it's conceived of as a flexible policy toolkit that really combines principles of economic growth and environmental mitigation in the context of climate change crises. This toolkit contains things like command and control environmental regulations, recommendations for multi-sectoral reforms across all sectors, really, resource efficient technology, renewable energy, forestry, recommendations for land use programs to balance emissions, and recommendations for developing and contributing to markets and developing market-like instruments for trading in these financialized environmental products that are derived from intact natural capital assets. So not all aspects of the green economy are specifically oriented around nature financialization, but what they are all linked to is the concept of mitigation. Mitigation in terms of reducing and preventing greenhouse gas emissions, which also involves displacing and trading liability for greenhouse gas emissions that do occur. So that concept of mitigation is something that links like low carbon transport infrastructure to things like financialization programs. So they're not just sitting apart from one another, they're really quite connected. And they come together in the context of the crises of the 21st century. And one of these big crises that we've all experienced is the global economic crisis of 2007, 2008, 2009, however you want to account for it. And the other, of course, is looming environmental crisis. Now, in terms of thinking about the green economy as this big flexible policy toolkit, part of its compelling message, part of its branding, is it brands itself on the proposed, what they call triple win of the green economy. And this triple win basically represents sustained economic growth, environmental sustainability, and poverty alleviation by applying green economy principles and inclusive growth principles to development programming. So basically, we're not just talking about a win-win, but a win-win-win in all potential contexts, as long as the principles are followed. Now, of course, this being a relatively new, really post-2012, set of policy ideas, policy toolkit, it's of course still quite experimental, and the triple win claims of the green economy really do need to be tested. So far, there's not very much evidence for the triple win in particular project evaluations, but I guess we have yet to see. Now, within this green economy policy structure, basically, I mean, we're talking about developing a system internationally. We have basically 3 different categories of actors. So we have the UN system and multilateral development banks as one kind of group that we're talking about. We have private sector partners, and we have the public sector. And according to the United Nations documents that really kind of brought these ideas of the green economy together in the run-up to 2012, these are the 3 primary groups of actors involved in the green economy. The roles and responsibilities of the UN system and multilateral development banks are to basically provide technical advice and support, to provide the ideas and the recommendations for reforms. The private sector has an important role of investing and innovating. The public sector, which includes national, subnational, and local governments, basically has the majority of the responsibilities in realizing these reforms and attracting investment, ensuring that policy reform happens, mainstreaming or environmental mainstreaming, ensuring that environmental principles get integrated into all areas of policymaking, capacity building to realize this in practice, ensuring safety or a safe environment for investors, low risk environment for investors, and managing and accounting for actual resources upon which these resource-based financial instruments are created. So, and it's actually quite complex, even though this might look like just a straightforward set of roles and responsibility. There's a lot of collaboration and work across groups that has to happen in order to fund and apply reforms and come up with the appropriate reforms for particular contexts in the context of regional level planning, existing national level environmental programs, and existing protected area networks and particular protected areas that a lot of these programs are built on. So just to give you an idea of the complexity, this is just the partners that were listed as being involved in what's it called? There's so many coalitions. The Green Economy Coalition, actually. So this isn't the full exhaustive list, but the who of the green economy, including roles, responsibilities for funding, for coming up with policy recommendations, for carrying out things, is very complicated. Now here's the rest of them. And actually Step Center is a partner in this too. But the green economy really involves diverse networks, including, it includes research institutes, it includes universities, governments, environmental NGOs, private corporations, banks, bankers, intergovernmental organizations. I'm doing research around the SADC right now, civil society organizations, and a lot of other types of groups of stakeholders. So it's quite complex when you actually start getting to the nitty-gritty of policy production here and consensus seeking and things like that. So let's say you're creating financial instruments. Earlier on I said financialization is, in a way it's about connecting place-based resources with global environmental markets by creating new kind of avenues for capital investment. And a big way that this happens under the green economy reforms is actually a continuation from previous environmental policy phases, international environmental policy. But it does this really through the creation of emissions markets and mechanisms that link these place-based systems to the global kind of market. A big one of these is, of course, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, plus conservation and sustainable development, or REDD or REDD+. This is one of the particular mechanisms that's heavily implicated in green economy reforms that are directly related to the financialization of natural resources. Other examples are the Clean Development Mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol, which is one of 3 basic finance mechanism or flexibility mechanisms that are part of the Kyoto Protocol that basically sets up types of mitigation relationships between countries. So you can have particular projects in, let's say, a lesser developed country, selling credits to a particular company or organization or, even county or city in a more developed context in order to offset greenhouse gas emissions. So that's going to be a familiar concept to a lot of people. I want to talk a little bit about the intellectual foundations. I mean, this is the STEP summer school, so thinking about narratives and pathways I think is important when we're thinking about policy. So the intellectual foundations of the green economy approach, this mitigation-oriented, heavily dependent on financialization approach, include, really conventional growth-oriented development economics, environmental economics, and ecological economics. Now, environmental economics and ecological economics are not the same thing. Environmental economics tends to apply the principles of economics to studying how environmental and natural processes can be developed and managed, whereas ecological economics deals more with relationships between natural systems and economies over time and things like that. But the green economy has been very heavily influenced by development economics and environmental economics, to a lesser extent by ecological economics, but ecological economics has given the green economy some very important concepts, like ecological limits, like the concept of natural capital, like the idea of the global commons or ideas about the global commons and things like that. So basically the dominant framing of the green economy, which really comes from this kind of foundational work, Blueprint for a Green Economy, that was published in 1989, is that economy, environment, and society are basically kind of discrete and distinguishable domains, and nature and natural processes have traditionally been this kind of neglected domain of a world that's ultimately governed by markets and market principles. So this is kind of the kind of philosophical framing on which a lot of green economy policy is ultimately drawing from. Now, basically, there is, kind of a coherent policy narrative embodied in the green economy and in ideas of green growth. You can, if you read these policy documents and read articles about valuing natural assets and the importance of doing that effectively, you'll see a definite problem laid out, that economic growth and environmental sustainability are fundamentally at odds because of market failures, basically. That environmental preservation and economic growth can be compatible policy objectives, but only when environmental assets and functions are priced correctly. So if environmental functions, and this leads to the result, if environmental functions that sustain us and keep us alive are not priced correctly, if they're essentially free to use, then what the result is a global, basically, tragedy of the commons, in which people overexploit common pool resources and degrade the environment because they don't value it properly in their decisions that they make about resource use. So following this narrative, this framing, if environmental services like clean water, clean air, erosion control, coastal protection, all these things that I mentioned earlier are free of charge, they, in addition to being prone to degrading behavior, they also won't receive policy attention. And proponents of green economy reforms contend that these market failures can be resolved by effectively accounting for and accurately pricing natural assets and functions. As a result of this, the outcome of the appropriate level of intervention will be a correction of these market failures, resulting in global policy transitions that can achieve sustainable economic growth that's socially inclusive, pro-poor, universal, and in fact it must be universal. It must be like a cumulative transition, but it must also be flexible, realizing that not every, let's say, country can necessarily put the same sorts of policies or the same flavor of policies into effect as others. And I just highlighted here the aspects of this that touch on the triple win promise that we talked about earlier. So just to sum up a little bit, while the conceptual origins of the green economy really lie in the 1980s, we didn't see a massive policy uptake of ideas around financialization and mitigation through financialization, especially until the 21st century. And this was due to a lot of factors. And a lot of these factors are going to be things that we've lived with throughout our lives, like international policy trends and agreements since the 1990s regarding sustainability and climate change. And these include the outcomes and policy work that's been done since of the UN Conference on Environment and Development in 1992, things like Agenda 21, and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Kyoto Protocol that extended it. There's been lots of work on environmental mainstreaming and development policies. There's been a lot of other stuff related to finance, like increasing importance of private finance to conservation and development, the series of financial booms and busts throughout the 2000s. Like, these are all things that we've been cognizant of through our whole lives, and they've been really important to shaping the contemporary kind of landscape of, you know, what environmental possibilities or what are seen as feasible possibilities for environmental and economic remedy. But yeah, like I said before, the green economy really coalesced around 2012, around the UN Conference on Sustainable Development, also called Rio 20, and it really became an organizing brand for global socio-environmental transitions toward a particular type of sustainability. What I said before, that in which nature has to be managed in order to be productive, and it must work and like kind of do labor conceptually in order to earn its preservation. Now, coming out of this, there are a lot of emerging issues, and definitely linkages to what Jeremy was talking about with global securitization of resources, in terms of thinking about what's going on outside of this kind of global or international policy discourse level. There's a lot of complexity at the intersection of local histories and policy histories. So understanding what's going on at the kind of social, political, conservation, value, policy intersection in these processes of transition, I think is really key to understanding struggles over value that are being played out across levels and scales, and also issues of equity and inequality. So these are really big issues, and it connects to what Lila's going to be talking about around land and water grabs. But really, there are really big issues related to things like equity and increasing inequalities, because when you're talking about financializing basically place-based resources, you have to have control over places in order to control or attempt to manage the ecological value that's embodied in them, basically. So you see big trends in shifting rights and control over resources and landscapes, particularly in poorer countries in the world or lower income countries. And this highlights issues of labor accumulation, grabbing, and issues like Jeremy said of enclosure, territorialization, potentials for conflict, violence and abuses of power. And amidst all this, of course, there are governance challenges, environmental management challenges. And there are a lot of critics of financialization and green economy reforms. And one of the big questions that keeps getting asked and debated is, is financialization and, on a bigger scale, kind of green economy proposals a resolution for global economic and environmental crises, or kind of a way or a pathway that's going to lead to more kind of unfolding problems than solutions? So that's just a question to leave you with.